Hi, everybody. My name is Kathleen Cummin, and I'm really excited to be here. I want to begin by acknowledging that I am privileged to be here on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish people. And I say that not to acknowledge the lands so much as to acknowledge the legacy and the ongoing legacy of colonization. I am a member of the Early Childhood Pedagogy Network and part of the group that put on the Instructor's Stream. And today it is my great honor and privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Affrica Taylor. Affrica is an adjunct professor at the University of Canberra. She's also the convener of the Common World's Research Collective. Affrica was the first scholar to question the problematic separation between nature and culture in early childhood education. Many of us from Articulation will remember her presentation at Capilano University when she shared with us her first book, Reconfiguring the Natures of Childhood. Her most recent book is The Common Worlds of Children and Animals. Affrica is also a colleague, a friend, and a fellow traveler. Please join me in welcoming Affrica Taylor.
Okay, thanks so much, Kathleen. It's great to be back. And I'd like to acknowledge, as we do in Australia as well, that we're meeting on the lands of the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, including the Musqueam, the Squamish and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I wanted to extend a thanks to Shane Point, the knowledge keeper as well, who I'm sure he's left, but he made me feel very welcome as a visitor from somewhere else. And so, of course, have those who've sort of brought me to the conference. So also thanks so much to Kathleen, again, Kathleen Cummin, to Sonia Tavares, and to my good friend and colleague, Veronica Pasiniket-Jabor. So I'm going to just have to pause a moment to set my thing up because I'm using my own computer. So I'm not quite sure what's happening at the back there. I can see it on my computer screen. So I'm not quite sure, because I can't see a thing, whether the people up the back doing the technicals are onto it or not. Okay. Oh, there it is. Okay, great. We're ready. So I'm really interested in the question, what happens to pedagogical practice and documentation when you shift the focus from following the child to following children's common world relations? And this is a question that I've been pursuing and trying to enact for many years now in the experimenting that I do with research methods and writing. More specifically, I've been following and writing stories about preschool children's everyday relations with local urban wildlife on Ngunnawal country, which is the Aboriginal people's land where the city of Canberra is now built. And of course, like here in British Columbia, this is a settler colonial context, which is very significant to the work that I do. So my motivation's been to better understand and communicate the pedagogical significance of these relations, these common world relations, and to learn from them. So I actually feel as if I learn a lot from my observations of children's relations with wildlife. As a cultural geographer with decades of involvement in Indigenous education in Australia. I see my methods and writing practices as place-attuned, relational and ethnographic. But as a fellow traveller of early childhood education, I'm also aware that the methods and narratives that I use might be regarded as a form of pedagogical documentation or narration, and because of that I hope that what I do, which isn't exactly what you do, at least speaks to what you do. But I'm going to find out at the end whether you think that that's the case or not. So in the first half of the presentation, it's kind of divided into two. I'll read you a short essay that I've written that narrates and reflects upon a series of increasingly fraught child-rabbit encounters and relations. And this is one of the chapter in Denise Hodgins' excellent edited collection, Feminist Post-Qualitative Research for 21st Century Childhoods, Commonwealth's Methods. Now, a number of people I know in the audience also have chapters in this book, and it's very hot off the press. We haven't even received our copies yet, but I think Denise has, so I think it actually does exist. Anyway, there's a picture of it on the internet, so it must be real. So my chapter, the one I'm going to read you, it's only a short one, is called Rabbiting, Grappling with the Troubling Legacies of Invasion. So the narratives in my rabbiting essay are drawn from a Commonwealth's environmental pedagogical research project called Walking with Wildlife in Wild Weather Times, and this is an image taken from on the Commonwealth's website that also connects into a blog for the same project, which I'll be showing you later on. My co-researcher, Dr. Tonya Rooney, and I, we've been using multi-species ethnographic walking methods in this project, and in collaboration with the teachers, the educators and the children from the University Childcare and Preschool Centre at the Australian National University in Canberra. So it's over an 18-month period. Tonya and I went on fortnightly walks with a select small group of preschool children and teacher educators from the centre. The walks were in a grassy woodlands area adjacent to the centre and on the university campus, and you can see in this image what this looks like, these grassy woodlands look like. They go from the university campus down to a lake, Lake Burley Griffin. So this is a very important site for a couple of reasons. Most importantly, it was a meeting place for Aboriginal people for millennia before settlement, and it actually continued, these meetings continued up until the late 19th century. It's a place where bogong moths migrate from the north, thousands of kilometres in the summer, and they shelter in the caves in the mountains to keep cool, and then they migrate back up again in the next autumn when it's starting to cool down. And Aboriginal peoples from lots of different language groups from a very, very wide area used to walk up to this meeting place on Ngunnawal country and have bogong moth ceremonies and feast on the moths, very high in protein and very good for you, and they obviously had a lot of parties. So across the seasons in our project, we've followed the children's unfolding relations with resident wildlife in this place. And the rabbiting stories that I'm focusing upon today literally kind of fell out of this research. Not because we decided we were going to look at rabbits and children, but just because the children had a compelling and persistent curiosity about the rabbits, despite or perhaps because of some very confronting encounters with them. So these encounters with the rabbits became increasingly complex and increasingly sort of entangled, and they pushed me to think really hard about what was going on in the context of a settler colonial society in which invasion is a key motif, and you'll know what I mean when I read you the essay. Then after I've read it, I'll tell you the backstory to its making. So I wanted to show you some of the blog entries that Tonya and I made after the walks, usually the day after. And these have fed into this essay that I'm going to read you, or parts of them feed into it. I mean, there's a lot of blogs, but we've just selected bits. And the other reason I want to show you the blog entries is to be able to foreground the strategies that we use for noticing, following and narrating children's common world relations. And I have to just say now that they're not perfect. We make lots of mistakes, but we can talk about some of those as well, some of the tricky bits that are really hard to get right. I'll note some of the challenges we've faced while endeavouring to follow relations instead of individual children on the walks and in the writings. And I'll also refer to some of the key thinkers who've helped me to shape the blog accounts of these child rabbit encounters into an essay that reflects upon what we might all learn from children's ways of grappling with the troubling legacies of settler colonisation. The rabbiting essay is structured around a kind of a conversation or a dialogue between a series of rabbit tales and some of my broader reflections upon what might have been going on during these encounters, which are quite speculative, as they can only ever be. The tales are based on a selection of child rabbit encounters I witnessed during the walks, and my reflections draw upon broad interdisciplinary readings. So I use this kind of dialogical form as a way of performing the iterative process of common worlding methods and pedagogies, but also as a way of revealing and considering how we might be informed by the ways in which children are already learning with others in their common worlds. So, on to the story. It's called Rabbiting, Grappling with the Troubling Legacies of Invasion. The parkland areas of the Australian National University campus where we walk with the children is right on the edge of Canberra's central business district. This is Ngunnawal country. Before colonisation and before the city was built, eastern grey kangaroos grazed on the native grasses and sheltered under the box gum trees. Today, this remnant native grassy woodland urban area is registered as a threatened ecological community and is heritage listed for conservation. Wild European rabbits have replaced kangaroos as the dominant grazing species. Along with the surrounding urban human settlement, it's now rabbits who pose the greatest threat to this native grassy woodlands ecological community. So, first tale, spotting rabbits. Look, quick, there's one. Where? It's running away from us. See that little thing bobbing up and down? Oh, now it's gone. I can see one over there. It's heading for that tree. We saw bunnies. Hey, everyone, we saw 2 bunnies. Rabbit spotting is one of the children's favourite walking activities. These small, shy animals are fast and elusive. When disturbed, they dash off and hide in the long tussock grasses or run down their burrows. So for the children, it's a compelling challenge to get a good look at the rabbits, and any fleeting sighting is worthy of acclaim. As well as spotting actual rabbits, the children also like to spot rabbit clues. These are abundant, unlike the rabbits. Well, they are abundant, but we just don't see them. Rabbit scratchings, burrows and large piles of rabbit poo are a ubiquitous feature of the landscape, marking and reshaping it on a seemingly daily basis. The children have become so accustomed to these burgeoning rabbit signs, that they've become quite blasé about them. So they used to have this thing where they'd say, oh, another rabbit toilet, and they'd sort of chant it as they walked along in these ho-hum type sort of tones. They were not so blasé when they spotted their first dead rabbit lying next to a burrow. The children solemnly gathered around it to inspect it at close quarters. The body was completely intact, so at first they maintained hope. Maybe it's just asleep. Despite a gradual realisation that the rabbit was indeed dead, the children still seemed moved by its apparent vulnerability. It was inclement weather, and the body was exposed to the elements. They were worried about leaving it there all alone. He might get wet, one child mused, as she and others looked down at the small, still body. After this first encounter, stumbling across dead rabbits quickly became a regular occurrence, prompting us to wonder what was going on. The children started speculating. Maybe a fox grabbed the bunny and pulled out its fur and then picked it up and ran over here and killed it. But it didn't eat it all and it ran away down there. As these grisly dead rabbit spottings became increasingly frequent, a number of children were drawn to closely inspect the decaying bodies or body parts. They seemed to be gaining confidence, the kind of confidence that comes from familiar curiosity. I can see where its eyes were. I can see its nose. Its nose is peeling. They noted how quickly the fur falls off the rabbits' bodies, exposing the skin and muscles underneath. They set about identifying the different kinds of exposed bones. They used magnifying glasses to closely inspect inside the body cavities and noticed that worms and bugs were often eating the remains. Despite their forensic interest in the decomposition process, the children did not forget that these remains belonged to previous living beings. They punctuated their examinations with spontaneous expressions of sadness and sympathy, such as, "I'm sorry this happened to you, Bunny." Rabbiting. The term rabbiting is part of the Australian bush vernacular. It literally means killing rabbits and is a state-sanctioned national pastime in rural Australia. The rabbiting saga began in the mid-19th century when settler gentry imported and released a handful of wild European rabbits to establish a popular British gentleman's sport of hunting in the Antipodes. The project didn't turn out quite as anticipated because without predators, wild rabbits quickly multiplied and spread across the continent. They ate every blade of grass in sight, triggering a cascade of native species extinctions. Notwithstanding that Indigenous Australians regard white settlers as invaders, and that it was the white settler invaders who brought the rabbits with them, the indisputable environmental damage caused by the rabbits has since earned them the status of one of Australia's key invasive species. It's also justified a retaliative settler war against feral rabbits that's ongoing to this day. This invasive rabbit legacy, with all its inherent ironies, is one of the significant settler colonial messes that contemporary Australian children inherit. Rabbiting can be seen as of the killing variety, can be seen as an exemplar of separation, mastery and control. This is the sequence of delusional Euro-Western man-over-nature fantasies that environmental philosophers Val Plumwood and Deborah Bird Rose closely associate with white settler colonial beliefs, actions and legacies in the Australian context, but everywhere really. Rabbiting requires white settlers as environmental stewards to distance themselves from rabbits as invaders in order to carry out the violent measures needed to eradicate them. Kate Wright points out that Australian children are a target audience for the eco-nationalist narratives that accompany and rationalise the redemptive violence involved in systematically slaughtering rabbits. These narratives seek to convince children that rabbit love is inappropriate. This is a quote from Kate Wright. It's inappropriate because it conflicts with ecological politics, end of quote. In other words, Australian children inherit a very troubling settler rabbiting legacy. In direct contrast to the predominantly lovable portrayal of rabbits in European children's popular culture, Australian settler eco-nationalist popular culture encourages children to dissociate from and ultimately hate invading rabbits in order to prove their love for their country. Second tale, becoming rabbits. The children would love to pursue the rabbits when they scurry into the patches of native tussock and lomandra grasses that conceal their warrens. But in summer, in Australia, the ever-present risk of treading on a snake precludes them from venturing into these thick grasses. Basically, we don't let them. So when the weather cools down and we're sure that the snakes have all hibernated, the children are keen to inspect the rabbits' grassy abodes. They find lots of burrows, scratchings and droppings secreted throughout. But the rabbits are nowhere to be seen. Although the children never manage to see live rabbits close up, as soon as they can immerse themselves in the tussock grasses where the rabbits live, they imagine that they are rabbits. This is one of their favourite games. Crouching down in the long grass, they smell the same grassy smells that the rabbits presumably smell. Pushing their way through the thick tufts, they feel the same friction of spiky grass on their bodies that the rabbits presumably feel. Ensconced in thick, grassy rabbit worlds, they spontaneously become rabbits, hopping around, sitting up on their haunches, twitching their noses, smelling the breeze, simulating nibbling on grass and doing rabbit poos. "Look, I'm a camouflaged rabbit. I'm camouflaged in the grass," a child calls out, encouraging others to join in. They seem to be trying to get as close as they can to a full sensory embodiment of rabbitness. At some point in the year, and in response to the children's growing interest in rabbits, the preschool teachers decided it was time to introduce the children to a controversial picture book called The Rabbits. This is an allegorical fable about the colonisation of Australia. Originally written for older readers, the colonisation narrative is categorically structured around the binary of good Indigenes and bad foreign invaders. The rabbits are the evil protagonists. They represent the British settler colonisers as invaders and environmental destroyers. The narrator numbats, which are small endangered marsupials, are meek and they're innocent, and they represent the colonised Indigenes who witness from the sidelines with horror as the rabbits destroy their country and steal their children. We cannot be sure whether or not it was a coincidence, but sometime after reading this book, we noticed a shift in the tone of the children's rabbit play. A group of children transformed into, and this is what they, in their words, they were, killer rabbits that like eating people. They took to using a weeping acacia tree as their hideout from which to plot and execute high-spirited ambushes on adults, in other words, us. Rather than violent, however, the repeated raids of the carnivore rabbits, which is what they call themselves too, were marked by loud and excited laughter. Grappling. In the Australian settler colonial context, child-rabbit relations are far from straightforward and innocent. This is simply because non-Indigenous Australian children and rabbits are already entangled and co-implicated in messy, invasive colonial legacies. Our walks in the grassy woodlands have incrementally uncovered the troubling mess of this inheritance. Once unveiled, the pressing question becomes how best to deal with this trouble. We're cognizant of the increasing pressures on the children to distance themselves from rabbits and thereby disidentify with the invasion and destructive forces of colonisation. We realise that there are expectations that the children will align themselves as future environmental stewards and may well be tasked to save us from the rabbits. This is a quote from the book, the Rabbits book. It ends with this, "Who will save us from the rabbits?" No matter how noble the intentions, heroic white settler stewardship requires us to perform some kind of separation, mastery and control. The children did not do that. We observed how, instead of rehearsing an exonerating and or vindicating goodies and baddies script, the children continued to grapple with the troubling legacies of rabbit invasion, with all their contradictory pulls and pushes. This grappling was expressed through the ways in which they sought connection with the rabbits, even as they were trying to come to terms with a dawning realisation that rabbits have a destructive impact on the Australian environment. The children's grapplings evoked Donna Haraway's urging that we must learn how to inherit by what she calls staying with the trouble and working in tandem with other species towards a modest form of recuperation. Staying with the trouble stands in stark contrast to the conceit and folly of seeking ultimate and final humans to the rescue solutions. Rather than seeking such heroic solutions, the children's grapplings perform a kind of ongoing relational ethics that includes more than human others within the ethical domain. They remind me of the multi-species ethics of conviviality that Tom Van Duren and Deborah Bird Rose advocate as they call for more inclusive and respectful ways of living in our increasingly multi-species cities. And finally, the children's ongoing rabbit grapplings exemplified what Rose refers to in the specifically settler colonial Australian context as a much-needed decolonising ethics for a wild country. Third tale, staying with the rabbits. In light of the children's deepening rabbit relations and grapplings, we decided to take them to the Rabbits in Australia exhibition at the National Museum of Australia. It's just down the road from the centre. It's just next to the ANU campus. No sooner had we set off, buffeted by strong cold winds, that we came across a sodden rabbit head in the middle of the footpath. It was an uncanny and foreboding sign. The children broke out into a nervous, rhythmic chant. "Dead bunny head, dead bunny head." The chilling mood of this unnerving encounter was echoed inside the museum exhibition. Although the museum claims to be representing the diversity of relationships that Australians have had with wild rabbits since European settlement, the children were instantly transfixed by the displays featuring the numerous ways that settlers have killed rabbits. For instance, by fumigating, ripping and dynamiting burrows, shooting, poisoning and trapping rabbits, and releasing rabbit calicivirus, which was actually the reason back in Canberra for all those dead rabbits. They just released a new strain of the virus. From their shocked facial expressions and many incredulous questions, it was clear that they were completely taken aback by all the emphasis on killing. Although some also expressed curiosity about how the killing technologies worked. So how exactly does the rabbit trap catch and kill the rabbit? The rabbit traps and poisoned carrots held a particular grim fascination. The images that revealed the sheer volume of rabbits killed in the ongoing wars waged against them made a huge impression on the children. However, even as the artefactual evidence that millions and millions of rabbits had been killed came across loud and clear, the children still struggled to understand why. Their attention eventually turned to the imposing neon map of Australia up on the wall. It was one of those digital displays, and it was called Invasive Species. They watched it light up in red to show the rapid spread of rabbits across the continent. This seemed to help them register the scale of the rabbit problem. There's a lot of rabbits in Australia, yeah, they said, and whoa, rabbits all along Australia. However, despite our attempts at explaining the ecological rationale behind this invasive species display, there were too many rabbits, they were eating all the grass, and this meant that other creatures would not survive and the rabbits needed to be culled. The children's overwhelming sympathy remained with the rabbits. The final straw came as they clustered around a small screen, watching an early 20th century documentary ominously entitled Menace of the Rabbit. The children were aghast at the sight of thousands of frightened and defenceless rabbits being slaughtered and skinned. So they'd kill them and then they'd rip the skins off up to their heads. So they were watching this with like complete horror. Poor bunnies, they kept repeating over and over, and that is so horrible. That's not fair for the rabbits. To the children, these horrifying images only served to confirm the impression they'd gained from the entire museum experience. It was the people who were the menacing threat, quite obviously. They'd had enough of it. They told us so in no uncertain terms the next time we met. They had been mulling over the things they'd seen in the olden days, as they put it, at the museum, and they admitted that they felt scared watching the rabbits being killed. Their own feelings of vulnerability reinforced their empathy with the rabbits, even though they also accepted that too many rabbits cause problems for the environment. They seemed to be able to grasp and hold the deeply ecological understanding that all living beings are both dependent on and vulnerable to each other. In visceral and affective ways, they apprehended that we cannot be separated off, no matter how wild the invasive colonial legacies we're grappling with. So that's the paper. And what I've done now is prepared some slides that I'll just talk to, which sort of set out some of the key ideas and principles that lie behind, what propels the work, what shapes the approach, and also what leads to the writing of a piece like that. So I wanted to start with some of the premises of this notion of common worlds and common world lives and pedagogies. I first encountered the term common worlds when I was reading Bruno Latour's book, The Politics of Nature. He wrote it a long time ago, think it was 1998. I should know, but I've forgotten. But he used it as a way, as a kind of a foil for what he describes as the Great Divide, which is, you know, the nature-culture divide that's so foundational to Western thinking. And within that divide, that Great Divide, you know, the humans are on the culture side and everything else is on the nature side. And, you know, we see ourselves as separate. Other philosophers like Val Plum would have talked about it as in terms of a hyper-separation. We see ourselves as separate and superior to everything else because we're so smart. Basically, that's it. So his notion of common worlds, he offers as a concept that provides an alternative way of thinking who we are and what's happening. So commonwealths is a very collective term, and it's a very active term. So the commonwealths includes humans and non-humans, so everything. Non-human beings, as well as human beings, as well as, you know, landscapes and spirits and rocks and water and winds and forces, all of it. So the commonwealth is the world we live in. It's the whole thing, okay? It's the whole thing. And I found it to be a really good concept, for me at least, as a way of sort of thinking beyond the very kind of dominant view in education that, you know, children grow up in a society. So I guess I wanted the idea of commonwealths to speak to the fact that it's not actually true. I mean, we do grow up in a society, but that society isn't a bubble. It's not separated off from the rest of the world. It's completely entangled with it. It's inseparable. So I you know, started thinking and talking about the ways in which children live in a world and learn in a world, not just in a human society. All sorts of things are going on. And not all of them are human. The next point about, I suppose, this idea of a commonwealth life is that they're inextricably entangled, so you can't separate any of it out. In the end, it's all interconnected because it's all part of the force of this planet that we work on, that we live on, that's provided and sustains the conditions of possibility for life as we know it, for everything that's here with us and has come before us, and it's all interconnected. None of it exists separately. Then the next idea is that commonwealths is not, like I started to say, Latour described as more like a verb than a noun. It's an active thing, so it's a bit like common worlding or commoning. So these worlds never stay still, as we know. They're dynamic. They're always being made and remade, and they get made and remade through relations, not through individual units or individual beings or individual entities, but in a response, reaction, interaction between everything, between things. So moving from that, and then lots of people have taken up this idea, particularly using Karen Barad's work from the new feminist materialisms, that all learning is relational. So the learning actually comes from the new thing that's created in relation. But people have been theorising relationality in Western in the Western Academy for a long time now, and it's sort of like everything is relational. I mean, yeah, quantum physicists will tell you this as well. Okay, so that's just a sort of a basic guide. I have to keep my eye closely on the time. I'm not quite sure what time we started, actually, and how much longer I've got. Does anyone? Okay, thanks. Because I wanted to show you a blog. I don't think I'm going to have time to sort of read it all, but you can have a look through. So remember I said that when I wrote the rabbit paper, I was drawing a lot of the material from the blog. But the blog is about more than just rabbits. It's, you know, what happened on our walks. And the process of recording these blogs was that after the walks, Tonya and I would go and have a cup of coffee and we'd sort of mull over what we saw and what seemed kind of significant. and pressing, and what sort of jumped out of us, and we'd think about it some more, and we'd talk to the educators as well to get their impressions, and we'd jot stuff down and write these blogs. They were a bit multi-purpose too. We were also writing them not only as a sort of a recording of what happened for our research purposes, our ethnographic research purposes, but we're also writing them, it's a public blog, so anyone can look, for the parents. So a lot of the parents whose children were involved in this project were particularly interested in what we're doing, and they wanted to know what was happening, and so it was for them as well. And the teachers and educators back in the centre also used the blogs for, follow-up work back in the centre when we weren't there. Okay, so this, one of the things that we were always trying to do as we're writing, and we didn't always achieve it, but we tried to get there, was to focus on following these relations and make our writing reflect that. So it's not that we wanted to ignore the fact that the children were there and we were really interested in them, because we are, and we didn't want to kind of absent them. And you can see they're very, very present in all of these blogs. But we didn't want to make it as if what was happening ever happened outside of a relation. So I think I might just read a little bit so you can get an idea of how we tried to convey this. So this blog, November 2016, and we'd just gone on another walk, another grassy walk. So the kangaroo grass heads were almost level with the children's almost along some of the sections of the track. Scattered amongst the native grasses, the delicate rattle grasses attracted our attention, and a couple of the children reached out to roll their weeping shell-like heads between their fingers and to pick them like a bunch of flowers. Inevitably, some of the spikiest and stickiest grass seeds lodged themselves in the children's shoes and socks. So the walk was punctuated by regular stops to pull them out. One group of children were intent on picking grass seed heads to make posies and decorate hats. They were quite preoccupied with this task, repeatedly declaring their love of the grasses and of the art and of the art of decoration. And one kid said, "Now that I've made this grass posy, I can get married." So throughout the walk, the children expressed a heightened awareness of the grass and its various functions and affordances. One child drew everyone's attention to a flattened area of dead grass. "Look, a kangaroo grass bed," she confidently proclaimed. "This is where a kangaroo lay down to sun itself," and it probably was too. Others noticed a pile of grassy stems and heads scattered on the ground. On closer inspection, they could see that ants were all swarming over the grass stems. They discussed how they were probably picking up the seeds and carrying them down their hole to feed the queen ant. Others still decided that lying around in the long grass and enjoying the warm sun, like the kangaroos do, is particularly enjoyable. They kept commenting on how soft and comfortable the grass was, like a bed. They made grass pillows and covered themselves up with grassy blankets, settling right in. And there's something about weed spraying. I'm going to leave that. A couple of children were so attracted to the grass that they carried some back to put in their lockers. Holding on to the grass seemed to trigger reflections upon its significance to their family life. As we walked, one child told us that her whole family likes grass. Her aunt's horse eats grass, her dogs eat grass when they feel sick, and they like to sleep in grassy beds. In fact, her house is full of bits of grass that the dogs bring in from outside. Another explained how her mum uses dried grass to make hats. "She made the hat I'm wearing out of grass," she declared proudly, and asked me to take a photo of it. So I don't know how much you can see in that, but the relational aspect of the learning, it's always, there's things going on. In this case, the grass is coming in that environment, is coming into the children's lives, and they're responding to it in certain ways, and in that interaction, that encounter that they're having with the grass, which is very relational, things are emerging. Okay. That seems to be frozen. There we go. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was following children's common world relations, how we do make this shift from following the child to following these unfolding worldly relations. I mean, I think from that grass thing you can sort of see how that works as well. We're following the relations that matter, that seem to sort of matter to the children, that matter to the children, that make a difference, so that matter in that kind of way, they make things happen. And also, obviously, relations that call the children. When I write things up, and certainly this is the same with Veronica, we've done a lot of writing together, we also follow relations that matter to us. And I guess for us, the whole issues of climate change and species extinction and warming oceans and all the other plastics and problems with waste and pollution and the whole sort of bundle of that, which is often referred to as the Anthropocene, does seem to be the kind of largest pressing issue facing children growing up in the 21st century. So in terms of relations that matter, we're often thinking in terms of these big picture sort of things. How is what's going on here? How can that help us think about a response to these bigger issues of concern? Affect is always really important, especially when you're kind of trying to work out relations that matter. One of the markers of whether a relation is mattering or not in terms of making something else happen is how much affect it has. And that affect is not just how the children are affected, but how whatever they're relating with is also affected. This was hard to see with the rabbits because they're so shy. But clearly the children affected them by scaring them and they'd run away whenever they saw them coming. But I think the story makes it pretty clear, all myriad of ways the children are affected by the rabbits and different aspects of their encounters with rabbits. The earlier work that I've done, a different ethnographic project, I did it a bit earlier in a different place. And the main relationship was between children and kangaroos. And that really was a two-way relationship. The kangaroos, over time, were clearly, they were clearly affected by the children, and their responses to them changed over time, and all sorts of things happened and developed over a couple of years. But I've written about that earlier. But affect, mutual affect, is the kind of key thing. It's a key indicator of a relation that's mattering. It's mattering. It's moving. It's making something new happen. Also, I guess what we do try and do, because there are so many interactions, and on one walk there's hundreds and hundreds of encounters, so you can't follow them all. So we are selective, and as the project goes along, we kind of end up following more closely relations that deepen and that become more and more complex, and that have a really high pedagogical potential, and that's why I chose to write about the rabbits. I could have written about the grass, but I wrote about the rabbits. Just because it is so messy. Those relations are so messy, so loaded and so fraught, and the ways that the children grappled with that was what really interested me. That was the pedagogical potential of that relationship, so that's what I followed up on. I was going to show you the Dead Bunnies blog, but I think I'll actually move on. You can always have a look at it yourselves. It's just there waiting to be clicked on. So narrating, so getting on to the writing, what we write and what we don't write. It's very similar to the noticing. So high levels of effect and the interactions and encounters that have high level of effect, we note, we notate, and we do this not just when writing and not just in blogs. We take lots and lots and lots of photos every time we walk. The children do a lot of drawing and arts work that relates to their walks. They make things So there's all sorts of ways that these significant encounters are notated. But for us, as the kind of researchers looking at this and thinking, what's going on here, we're really most interested in the common world relations that really are very compelling for the children, that are very persistent and that complexify, same as before. And all we can ever really do when we're looking at this is sort of speculate. What might be unfolding, what might be happening. And the children, do the same, of course. So you can hear it in that other blog that I just read out. But one of the hardest things of doing this kind of writing is writing in a way that sort of distributes agency. I've got attributes agency to the interaction or the relation, but another way of thinking about it is it distributes agency rather than simply always, every sentence beginning with the child does this or the child felt this or, so it was, a lot of it is just grammatical actually. It's sort of where you put the subject, where you put the object in relation to the verb. So we've spent a fair bit of time in our writing trying to finesse this. So for instance, I read you the writing about the grass, and in that we were kind of trying to convey how the grass had an agentic force upon the children. It stuck to their socks and it prickled their thing and it got to them. It sort of did something to them and they responded. So they didn't do it to the grass did it to them. So that's the sort of writing that we try and play with. I mean, we fall short often, but that's what we try and do. So let's have a look at this blog, The One-Legged Swan. If I can get the cursor back. No cursor. My machine behaves very differently when it's linked up to this. That's relational. I can't get it. Sorry, can't click it. Okay, you'll have to read it for yourself. The other thing that we do clearly is, apart from walking with children and talking about it and recording and noting and writing blogs, is we think with the thoughts of others. And this is incredibly important too, because things happen and you make sense of them in some way or another, or you begin to make sense of them. But the sense that you make of whatever it is that you've experienced is very kind of dependent on the conceptual tools you have to work with. So Donna Haraway is constantly saying it matters what ideas and concepts we use to think with. In fact, she usually says it matters what thoughts we think other thoughts with. So this is kind of really, really significant. If we have a very depleted source of concepts to think with, the sense that we'll make of something will be constrained. So it basically means doing a lot of reading, engaging a lot with materials that aren't specific to your disciplinary field, thinking beyond what's already thought, thinking in ways that exceed the kind of frames that predominate within any discipline. Every discipline has its kind of dominant paradigms. So to get beyond those, to think differently about what's going on here, to really push the boundaries and stretch yourself, you've got to read broader. So I think, for me, I've been doing this for a long time, and Donna Haraway's been one of the key people who's helped me stretch my thinking about what's going on. But clearly, for me, I'm always picking up the works of people who philosophise around relationality, and particularly I have a strong interest I'm sort of interested in the environmental humanities, but more specifically and I'm a geographer, so I'm very interested in place relations and Indigenous, non-Indigenous place relations, because I've got a background in Indigenous education. But I'm also really, because of what's happening on the planet at the moment, and we're in this 6th mass extinction event, which is the first in the known history of the planet, to be caused by human activities, not by natural forces. And in Australia, the rate of extinction since the continent was colonised by the British originally and then, settled by lots of people, it has one of the highest extinction rates in the world, the continent that's called Australia. And it's just been in the last couple of 100 years as this has happened. We've lost 35% of the world's mammals losses have been lost in Australia. So I'm really interested in extinction studies, which is kind of sub-branch of the environmental humanities. And it's really been led by Deborah Bird-Rose's work on the left here. This is one of the earlier books she wrote where she started writing about how you decolonise, how you develop an ethics for decolonising human relations as well as environmental human relations. How you do it. She sees this as the same thing. She's always talking about Indigenous genocide and ecocide being one and the same thing, and they are. People don't look after the land properly, it dies and people die. It's basically how it is. And if people are already moved off and they can't care for the land, and the people that move onto it and claim it and take it over don't know what to do with it, everything falls apart, which is exactly what's happened in Australia. So this is an image from one of Deb Bird-Rose's books, and on the right, one of the books you may be familiar with from Donna Haraway called Staying with the Trouble. It was published a few years ago. Okay, so it's really important, I think, to read beyond your field, but be very selective about it. Like, know what your interests are and what you're trying to, what your bigger picture framing for the work. What matters to you, basically? What matters to you beyond, in a big sort of way, and then who's going to help you think about your early childhood work in relation to what happens to you? Okay. So it's only by being challenged, by reading outside of your comfort zone, that you really get to do your own grappling, and that's with your own established habits of thought and your own practice. So it sort of pushes us too, to do something new. So thinking with the world around us in the Commonwealth, thinking with other people's thoughts, they're the kind of ways that I do it. So I'll stop there and I just open it up for questions, but I thought I'd offer these to you to think through. Basically, the ways in which I've been showing you how we attempt, not perfectly, to shift this focus from following the child to following children's Commonwealth relations. Does it, sort of prompt you to think that you could also sort of grapple with your established habits of thought and practice? Could you find ways to do something like it? Maybe you're already doing it and you'd like to share how. And then the other thing I thought about, because originally when Kathleen talked to me about preparing for this, she was saying, we're really interested in pedagogical narration, and there's, within the revised BC Early Learning Framework, there's this new emphasis on thinking with pedagogical narration. So I'm not an ECEC person, I'm a geographer who's worked in education, but maybe some of the strategies and methods I've been talking about from my work may have some relevance to your work in pedagogical narration. So, over to you. Oh. And now I'm looking at the size of this room. It's so cavernous and enormous.
We don't have a microphone, but if you have a question and have a great big loud voice like me, feel free. I know Dr. Twitter is open for a few minutes of questions.
You think it's intimidating to ask a question in this big room? Imagine what it's like to be standing up here and not be able to see anything and have an echo. Sorry, I only got the decolonisation.
Like what led you down the path? I'm curious about that.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, in the 1980s, I was a teacher in a remote Aboriginal community school. I learned so much more than I taught. I was completely out of my depth. I had my degree, I knew all about the individual child and their development, and none of it worked. They weren't individual children, they were all caterpillars, that was their dreaming. They didn't respond when you asked questions, you couldn't talk to, it just didn't work, nothing worked. All the things I'd been taught failed me. So all I could do was just observe, really, and learn from the mistakes I made. People were very kind. You know, they knew white fellas are sort of don't get it and take a while. And I did learn. So I worked in Aboriginal education for nearly 2 decades. I moved back to the East Coast and worked in an Aboriginal education unit in the University of Western Sydney throughout the 90s. And I've always been interested in, I can't even remember when I haven't really been interested in decolonisation. But then I guess when I studied a master's and then my PhD. Oh, and I'd actually done anthropology in my undergraduate degree. But when I studied post-colonial theory in the late 80s with Edward Said, it gave me this whole new way to see what was going on. So I had this kind of experience that really, well, it did this thing. It pushed me out of my established habits and thoughts of practice. It really discombobulated me. And this went on. I kind of got the hang of it after a while and understood a bit more about what was going on. And then the study I did and the theories that I was introduced to also helped me to kind of understand in a bigger way what was going on as well. So decolonising relations between colonised and colonising people has always been interesting and more for me. And more recently I see the connections with that and decolonising our ways of relating to the earth as well. Is that it?
Please join me in thanking Dr. Taylor for her very engaging presentation. It was wonderful.
A little something from us. Thank you. That was really wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's great.
Thank you so much.
Just the thing I need to take back all the
I
stuff
thought
I buy.
when she was talking about traveling, I thought, really? Because here's a cool backpack.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're heading off to a bit of a break now. We have a break from 2 to 2:30, and then we'll have our afternoon session start from 2:30 to 4. I just wanted to remind you of the invitation to join us for our celebration and award ceremony tonight on the 34th floor. Again, best views ever at 5:30 in the Seymour room. So please do join us. Remember to use the hashtags and download our apps to get the up-to-date information. But again, thank you for an engaging day, and we'll send you off to break and then to your afternoon sessions.